to newsagents.
We understand he was dressed as a chef.
So yes, he was wearing red and white check trousers, a white t-shirt and brown boots. It does sound very much like that was kitchenware that he was wearing, and that was what he was last seen in. Clearly he might be wearing something different now, which is why we've provided the public with a photograph of Daniel Khalife.
Imagine being dressed pretty much like Ronald McDonald and still thinking you can make a run for it. The prisoner, Daniel Khalife, 21 years old, who may, by the time you're listening to this, have been caught, managed to make his escape by clutching on to the underside of a truck in Wandsworth prison when he was working in the kitchens there. And today we'll be asking how he did it and how you catch a prisoner on the run. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's Emily.
And it's Lewis. And later on in the show we are going to be talking about what is perhaps the biggest piece of our post-Brexit architecture with Europe that is coming back into place. We are joining or rejoining the Horizon programme, and Europe, or indeed the world's biggest collaborative international science programme worth 100 billion euros a year. We're going to be rejoining. We're going to be talking about how that is going to be a template for our further engagement with Europe in the future.
But we're going to start with the escape of Daniel Khalife, and not just what it says about this extraordinary manhunt that it's kicked off to find a man who we're told poses a low risk to the public and yet is literally charged with terror offences. We know that this has caused a certain amount of mayhem in government, in the prison world, because questions are now being asked about why on earth this man, this terror suspect, was being held in Wandsworth prison, which was not that high security, where he was allowed to work every day, it seems, in the kitchens, and had the lassitude to be doing whatever he was doing for an hour before anyone even realised he was gone. And people are now starting to ask why he wasn't being held in a more secure jail, and what on earth the ramifications are for a government that can't even hold of its convicts and its prisoners. It's literally a metaphor for things starting to fall apart. But today we also want to dive into the mechanics of how you escape by holding onto a truck, of what happens when you get out of the gates, and what the police and security services and investigators and surveillance operators will be doing to try and track down a man who for 24 hours has been on the run. Well, joining us now is a former prisoner, a Wandsworth prison prisoner. And we should put this in context because Chris Atkins is also a BAFTA-nominated filmmaker, and he's just brought out a book, Time After Time, which is actually, it discusses a prison break
exactly.
in Wandsworth. But if we can use you, Chris, to take us inside Wandsworth prison and to talk us through the whole mechanics, first of all, of how you would be working in the kitchen and how much access and freedom you would have to do your own thing.
It's weird stories like this. They suddenly shine a light into sort of the hitherto sort of unseen world of the prison system, which most people get no access to whatsoever. They're like sort of hermetically sealed units. And the reason they keep it sealed is because they're so dysfunctional, they're so chaotic, they're so underfunded, they're so poorly run, that I think most people, if they witnessed what was going on inside Wandsworth on a daily basis, you'd be absolutely horrified.
Like what?
Well, the fact is that this came out the other day, that there was 1,500 inmates and there were 7 officers to look after them overnight. This came out in the House of Commons question last year. It's the fact that the officers are on minimum wage and they get 9 weeks training. They hire school because no one wants to do the job. It's such appalling conditions. It's such a terrible place to work.
Stressful.
So stressful. Huge numbers of them sign off with mental health problems. Huge numbers of them sign in sick, which is why the officer numbers are so low. They have a certain number of officers supposed to be on shift. A third of them don't turn up. And they'll even take people with criminal records, astonishingly, into the prison service now. And they have 9 weeks training, minimum wage, and they thrust these literally children onto the wings with a set of keys. And I was in a surreal position as a serving prisoner that these kids would come up to me looking like someone dressed as a prison officer for Halloween. You know, they just looked like they just found the costume. And they would ask me what time to open up for lunch. They'd ask me how the routine ran.
How old were they?
18, 19.
Wow.
Some of them didn't look like they started shaving, Lewis.
So you're in for fraud, right? For
tax fraud. Yeah.
And they start treating you like you're the responsible adult.
Absolutely. I used to walk around and people used to call me Gov because they thought I worked there. I got many jobs because the way to get out your cell is to get a job. It means you get more privileges and you get to phone home and shower and do all stuff like that. So I did dozens of jobs. And one of the craziest jobs I did was the register. So each day I was given a printed list of paper and I would tick prisoners off as they left the wing when they were going out to do jobs and education. Now, I was inside for a crime of dishonesty. I could have easily have ticked someone off saying they were present when they were actually halfway to France. But because they're so short-staffed, they rely on prisoners like myself to keep the place ticking over.
So did you know the kitchens?
I did know the kitchens, yeah.
And how much access have you got to come and go from the kitchens to the forecourt of the prison?
It was a very privileged job. So they rank jobs by the risk that that prisoner can manifest if something goes wrong. After I'd been there 9 months, I was very well trusted. I could pretty much go anywhere I wanted within the prison. The kitchens were seen as very sensitive because, one, they're outside the main block of the prison. So if you can imagine the old spider design of a prison, you have the circular centre, it's the panopticon if you want to look it up, and then you have the wings radiating off it. In the old days you'd have the kitchen at the centre. After Strangeways they changed that. Why? Because the prisoners got control of the kitchens, they could feed themselves. That's what went on for weeks. So after Strangeways, one of the things they did is they moved the site of the kitchens out of the centre and they built new buildings for them. And if you look at it on the Wandsworth map, you can see it. There's a new structure, of course, much closer to the prison gates. So you should only have very, very trusted inmates working there. Now, this guy was up on terror offences. He's facing decades inside, very, very serious crimes. He shouldn't have been anywhere near the kitchens. You've got knives there. You've got hot water and boiling oil and God knows what.
He hadn't been there that long.
He hadn't been there that long. I was there for months before they let me near the kitchens. So what you've got is an absolute failure to risk assess the guy. There were prisoners there who were seen as so high risk they weren't allowed out their cell. Others so high risk they weren't allowed off the wing. Others so high risk they could do a job, but maybe just a bucket and a mop for them. You know, that risk assess process has collapsed in this case.
And the kitchen door is close to the prison gates. Is that what you're saying?
It's closer to the prison gates than the wings.
How far?
I was just there now actually doing a piece for ITV News and I could actually see it. You can actually see the edge of the kitchens over there. Look, he didn't jump the fence. He didn't need to. By the sounds of things, he strapped himself to the underside of a van. So there's a bit of planning needed, but not very much. The van drives in through the main gate. It goes up. There will be deliveries. People will be taking produce on and off. He'd be one of the prisoners, I suspect, who was helping unload it. And then the van should have been driven out and inspected. They're supposed to go under it with mirrors and look at the underside. Clearly that didn't happen. Why? Staffing cuts.
It sounds to me, Chris, it sounds to me from what you're saying that in a way it's surprising more prisoners don't escape. Such as the paucity of resources now in the system. Were you surprised when you heard it?
I wasn't. I was surprised it doesn't happen more often. And I would say this: I've written my book Time After Time, which is out today, amazingly enough. And there's it's about
really involved in this.
Yeah, we're trying to understand
who's a little bit suspicious.
Who's the helping hand in the hives?
People think it's all part of my PR, and when the media rounds are over, I'm going to let them out of my wardrobe. But no, in Time After Time, I look at why people go back to prison again and again and again. Because the big problem in this country isn't so much crime; we have a problem of reoffending. So 80% of all offences are re-offences. They've been committed by people who've done it before. So rather than looking at individual crime, I'm trying to look at the pattern of why this terrible recidivism problem keeps going on. And one guy I looked at, and he's had been convicted of over 74 offences, called Simon McClellan. And one of his earlier offences was he escaped from Winchester jail. And in a very eerily similar circumstances to this, he basically exploited the incompetence of the system. And he escaped by pretending to be his own twin brother. Simon was facing about 4 or 5 years for GBH. So he got his brother to get arrested for drunk and disorderly. His brother came in and they ended up sharing a cell together and they switched places. It's like something out of a 50s farce, isn't it? You know, it's Alec Guinness or something. And he walked out the front gate. And when they picked him up, as they inevitably do, they normally get them, he was prosecuted for prison break and they had to drop the charges. Why? Because they're non-identical twins. When the judge saw the photos of the two of them together, he said, this is prison incompetence. This isn't a prison break. and drop the charges.
As somebody who's facially blind, I have a lot of sympathy with people not recognising brothers.
One of the many reasons that you're not involved in that prison system, of course.
Mercifully, it could get even worse.
But it's far. I describe it as like a dystopian Fawlty Towers. The chaos and madness was going. It kept me going in there. My first book, A Bit of a Stretch, was all about my time in prison, and the dark humour was just so off the charts. It just that actually kept my spirits up. It was so funny.
What was the thing which surprised you most about the experience and the security and the resources? I mean, you've described some of it, but it seems, to be honest, it almost sounds unbelievable. It sounds incredible.
It's astonishing. I mean, on a serious tone, the thing that surprised me most is I went to prison, having never ever been near a prison before, thinking it was all going to be like Porridge. Basically, it was all going to be full of people like Fletch and Gobber, the armed robbers and all the sort of old school crims. Not in the slightest. It is people mostly with very, very severe mental health problems, or people with horrendous drug addictions, or both. And those are the people who are filling Wandsworth, who are filling our prison system. It is people who are ill rather than people who are necessarily bad. And when they go to prison, all those problems are just made worse. They're not given mental health treatment. They're not given any drug therapy. They're given drugs because the place is awash with drugs, and they come out and they reoffend all over again. So that was the thing that really shocked me, was how it's not your kind of classic gangsters. There are some in there, but they're few and far between. It's just very, very damaged individuals who've been let down by the system. A lot of them have been in care since childhood. They've been abandoned by the education system, and they get washed up in our prisons.
You sound like a man who's glad to have been to prison. I mean, did you get more out of that than you thought?
It was, put it this way, it was an eye-opening experience, and like I quickly learned that the way to deal with it was to see it as a journalist with remarkable access. That's how I got through, if you really want to know. And I thought, right, I haven't got a camera, but I have a pen and paper, because I'm a documentary maker by trade. So I'm going to write down everything I see, and I almost became obsessional. I had pages and pages of A4 notes. They looked like the writings of a madman, because I'd write in block capitals for some reason. And so I kind of documented everything I saw.
And I thought, Emily always texts that way. So it's not a million
my
miles
friends
away,
thought I'd gone mad, because I was writing letters home to them in capitals, and they thought, oh God, Chris had lost his mind. So I kept a diary, and I thought, I have a platform. When I get out, I can talk about it. I can come on shows like this and say, look, what is happening inside our prisons is brutal, and it's inhumane. And it's turning people into worse criminals. People commit more crimes because they go to our prisons.
How do you think the inmates inside will have reacted to this?
With glee, I suspect. We had this thing in Wandsworth.
They'll be delighted that one of their own got out.
Of course.
Yeah.
Whenever we were in Wandsworth, and whenever we saw Wandsworth on the news, I suspect sometimes on Newsnight with one of you guys reporting, and you would say, and we now go to one of the most dangerous and dysfunctional prisons in the country, and you do a shot of Wandsworth, and everyone would start cheering and sort of kicking their doors.
So they watched Newsnight in Wandsworth prison?
God, yeah. Well, there's nothing else to do.
Probably where most of our audience came from, wasn't it, Emily?
Captive audience.
On a Thursday night.
Captive audience.
But whenever there was ever any reporting on the prison, it was like seeing your house on the marathon. You go, oh, look, there's us. Yay, Wandsworth, go. It was never for a good reason. It was always terrible reasons.
And they'll be thrilled he's got out.
Absolutely. They'll be cheering him on.
Chris Atkins, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching us all those years.
Yes.
I
feel like we're letting you down now. Joining us now is Nick Aldworth, who's the former National Counter-Terrorism Coordinator, and he led the operational security responses, I think I'm right in saying, after the terrorist attack in London in 2017. Nick, there are a couple of things that we just can't get out of the mind. One is this image. I mean, we haven't seen an image, but that idea of somebody crawling under the van and leaving the prison gates on the underbelly of a truck in a kitchen uniform. Now, that wasn't just done on spec, was it? He would have had to recce that or work with somebody or a truck driver to do that, do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, were it not so serious, it's almost comedic, isn't it? It's like a scene out of Paddington. But it is serious because we expect our prison estate to be secure. I mean, what we're dealing with here, as I understand it, is a former soldier. And of course, we train our soldiers to be smart, resilient, brave people. And there's no reason to suggest that once they stop soldiering, those qualities disappear. And so I think it is certainly not beyond the realms of probability, I think, rather than possibility, that this is something that he has self-initiated, that he has been working in the kitchen, he has spotted a weakness in their security and has possibly exploited it. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that he has done it on his own. And one of the really urgent things that will be investigated now will be, first of all, has there been help during the escape? Has there been help in planning the escape? And very importantly, has there been help from the inside of the prison service to make that happen as well? So all those things will be under investigation, but they will be concurrent with trying to find this guy.
And what will they be doing right now to try and find him?
So you take it back to the very first moment that you realise that he's gone missing, and what we would call the place last seen, and that's your starting point, and it literally is an expansive search from there. And one of the things that will be quite simple will be to spot this vehicle leaving, spot the direction that it's travelled, and effectively using the very comprehensive CCTV network in London, follow that vehicle's route. And a lot of that CCTV is recorded and stored, and it would not surprise me if we didn't already have an image of this guy having left the bottom of the vehicle or getting into another vehicle or whatever it might be.
I've heard it said in some of the reporting of this that it's those first few hours that you are most likely to be able to find someone. So is it basically, in terms of thinking about finding this guy at some point, is it a bad sign that we haven't found him yet?
No, not necessarily. And I think finding somebody in the depth of London is a somewhat more challenging job than it would be for some of the manhunts that I've undertaken in other police constabularies. But I think you're right that there are some golden hour principles that always apply in whether it's investigating a crime or responding to an incident, and that speed of response is absolutely critical for limiting the opportunity of further exploitation and escape. So my understanding, and it's only from media reporting, has been that there was about an hour delay in even recognising that this guy had disappeared, so that's not helpful. You can move quite a long way in London.
Very helpful to him.
Yeah,
what's your sense then? Where do you think he's gone?
Well, I think there's if you work on the principle that he's done this of his own volition, he's not going to hang on to the bottom of a truck for very long. So I suspect that he will have dropped off the bottom of that truck and then just made off into the conglomerate.
What, in minutes? I mean, in like 300 metres, or
I would have
how?
thought so. I would have thought so. I mean, you just think about that hanging onto the bottom of the truck. First speed hump would probably scrape you off. So I would be very surprised if he stayed on there for very long at all. Within meters of the gate, I would have thought. But I'm hypothesising because I've not seen the vehicle. Equally, I'm also not familiar with whether he's improvised any sort of attachment to help him do that. That's possible. And of course, the current investigation will be pursuing all those lines of inquiry. But one of the things I always find quite interesting is I date a crime writer, and she will tell you that it's an absolute nightmare writing books now because of CCTV. It takes the mystery out of everything, and particularly now that we also have not only CCTV, but we have video cams in cars and doorbell cams and you name it. It becomes.
We are a surveillance city.
We are a surveillance.
This
more
is right in
than
the middle
any
of
other
London.
Europe, more than any other place in Europe. London.
So we were all remembering, of course, the Happy Valley moment where James Norton disappears out of the court and turns himself into a cyclist, right? Because he's got his getaway, news agents. And all you need, I guess, is my point, is all you need is to not look like yourself. You don't really need to hide. You just need to have a cyclist helmet on or something, right?
Yeah, well, and how many chefs go to work in London across the course of the day? How many utility workers, how many service sector workers do we see walking around London? It's very easy to blend into a busy London borough. Very easy. People don't really turn their head for people who just look like they are normal workers. Now, if he's wearing something that is ostensibly visible as prison service uniform or prisoner's uniform, I think that perhaps changes slightly, but we're also a bit of a society that doesn't ask enough questions these days.
So what would you be doing? Would you be assuming that he had worked alongside somebody? You don't just climb under the underbelly of a van that's parked there, do you?
So I think that the investigation will start by taking this based on exclusively what they know. And the first thing is that they will do is they will try and identify the route of this van, they will try and identify the point at which he's dropped off, and then they will start to try and track his movements through CCTV. In 2017, following the Parsons Green bombing, we were really successful at using that tactic in tracking the offender down to the port of Dover, where he was subsequently arrested. So there's lots of ways of doing that. Certainly when I was younger, it used to be done manually, with people sitting in dark rooms and watching video. But actually there's a whole load of artificial intelligence now that can weave these videos together, and using things like facial recognition, clothing recognition. They're even capable of monitoring your gait as you walk, and it makes it very difficult to evade. So you can change your clothing if you like, but it will still follow you. So very clever. We've used that previously. It's very, very effective, and I think that will be the primary route for investigation at the moment. Running alongside that will be an investigation looking into this person's antecedents. So we will know everything about this person. He's been through the criminal justice system. So we'll know his shoe size, we'll know his fingerprints, we'll know who he used to associate with, we'll know where he used to live, we'll know who his friends used to be, where his parents are. And all of that will come into the investigation, because it's actually really hard to survive without a support network.
And can you give us a sense, how big is this investigation going to be? It seems like there is a whole lot of resource, rightly perhaps, but a lot of resource being thrown at this right now, from what we understand.
There'll be a lot of dedicated resource, but there'll be a greater amount of non-dedicated resource. And by that, what I mean is, when they put out a ports bulletin, for example, that's an alert that will go to every port in the UK, will go to every police area in the UK, and every police officer on duty in the UK at that time will know this person's identity. They'll know what they look like. And
every officer will have been briefed about it.
We'll go on in most operational briefings that will be on. And of course, it's been so widely disseminated across the media. Cops pick this stuff up in the media as well.
And finally, how easy would it be for him to get out of the country? Because that's presumably his aim or objective, right? How easy will that be for him?
So I don't know if you've travelled recently, but personally, even with a passport, I find it quite hard to get out of the country sometimes. So it's not easy to get out of the country. It's easier if you're supported. And there have been lots of cases of fugitives being flown from private airstrips out of the country, and then we chase them across Europe quite often. But without support, really difficult, because you do need a passport to get out. You do need a passport to get into whichever country of origin you're going to. We are very effective at searching at borders, aviation borders in particular. Maritime borders are as challenging. Things like Eurotunnel, Eurostar, great processes down there. I have a commercial relationship with some of these sectors, and you see how they conduct their activity. It is very, very difficult. But
he could stay inside the country but get outside by going to an embassy. That was the thing that you suggested.
So I think it's interesting, isn't it? So there are dynamics here around this individual, and without talking about the case, and I certainly can't because I'm not overly familiar with the detail of it, my understanding is that the Official Secrets Act charges that he faces are in relation to passing information to Iran. Now, government rather sensitively no longer refers to Iran as a hostile state. It refers to it, I think, as a state with hostile actors within it. But what's the possibility of this individual moving to an embassy and seeking asylum? We've certainly seen that, haven't we, in London with Julian Assange.
So you think he could be going straight to the Iranian embassy?
I wouldn't rule it out, and I've got no doubt at all that the Metropolitan Police Service won't have ruled that out either.
Fascinating. Nick, thanks so much. Really fascinated to hear from you.
So Emily started the show talking about the political impact, or referring to it. And there has been a pretty unfortunate symmetry in the way government ministers have been talking about this escape with how they were talking about the concrete crisis in schools earlier in the week. So Michelle Donnellan, the Science Secretary, told Sky News earlier today, she said, prisoner escapes like this remain very rare, just like concrete collapsing in schools is very rare, or you're very unlikely to be affected by it if you're a school child. And again, whilst both of those things are true, it doesn't do much for a government when it is in a position of ending the week, which is supposed to essentially be a relaunch week, having got to the end of it and been unable to assure the public that all school children will be safe and protected from literally falling concrete around their heads, and that all prisoners, especially prisoners who are guilty of terrorism, can be guaranteed to remain locked up. Like, that is a problem. And it started to remind me of just one of those, when you get to a sort of cascade of kind of catastrophe, sort of day after day after day. Do you remember Gordon Brown back in 2007? He had that week where, he cancelled the election that never was. And then day after day, it seemed like it was going to be like the plague of locusts by the end of the week. Midweek, they lost the tax disc, which contained the records and tax records of 14 million people. It was like disaster after disaster. And it just gives the impression of a government which is losing control. And they've got to, again, have a better narrative other than, oh, this doesn't happen very often.
I think there is no way that you can turn a man on the run into something that doesn't sound like utter chaos, even if it wasn't directly the fault of the Prime Minister or of the government. Not. The way that Keir Starmer is playing it today is by calling it a pattern of behaviour. And it's just what you're saying. As soon as you start to make, as it were, a listicle, you can create the sense in the public's mind that this is more of the same. And what he's done is he's pointed to the fact that we've had 10 Justice Secretaries. I'm going to say that again. We've had 10 Justice Secretaries over the last few years. So how on earth do you get stability? How on earth do you know who is being held where? How on earth do you decide which prisoners should be allowed to work in kitchens and which should be held at, category B prisons versus category A prisons, if you're constantly shuffling the personnel who are in charge of this? And I think that kind of takes you to the heart of what you're saying, which is a government who just constantly feels now it's on the back foot. Things are happening that it can't quite lock down.
Yeah, and there is, although of course it's not the Prime Minister's fault or the Justice Secretary's fault directly, this guy's escaped. And there obviously will be bigger questions for the prison service and Wandsworth in particular. There is a real public policy question, which is this question that Emily, you've already referred to, is why was he in a Category B prison rather than a Category A? And there have been people familiar with the prison service taking to the airwaves this morning saying, well, you know what? The capacity issues within the prison service are well known. I mean, we've had real examples in the last few months and years of, prisoners having to be kept in police prison cells rather than actual prisons. Such are the capacity and overcapacity problems within the prison service. So that is a really legitimate question to be asked of the government. And of course, it hasn't really, we're only on Thursday in terms of the week from hell for Sunak. There was more news this morning as well about another MP resigning and another critical by-election to come in probably just 6 weeks' time or so, which will create another big political headache. Another big political headache for the Prime Minister.
That's all coming up after a break.
Welcome back. So as we were saying, there is yet another, it's very exciting, this, by-election, which has been announced today. This is because, and this follows the other two, of course, which are coming up. One in Rutherglen, which is first in Scotland, crucial Labour SNP battle. And the other in Mid-Bedfordshire, of course, Nadine Dorries' old seat. Alas, not Lady Doris, but maybe one day. This one is in Tamworth, and this relates to Chris Pincher, who, in a way, you'll remember, was basically the straw which broke the camel's back of the Johnson government, because it was the allegations about him and a particularly unfortunate evening in the Carlton Club and his groping a young Conservative male aide, which eventually started the chain of events which led to Boris Johnson's resignation. He has been fighting or taking it to appeal a Privileges Committee inquiry into him, or Standards Committee inquiry into him, I should say, which he has lost. So he has decided, rather than inevitably having a recall petition which would be triggered against him, he's decided to throw in the towel, which will lead to another by-election in his Tamworth, Staffordshire constituency, where there is a Conservative majority of about 20,000, but which Labour will be the hot favourites to take the seat. So yet another headache for Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, it was interesting, the arguments he was making, because unlike sort of many others at the time, he didn't actually deny his actions. No. He was quite apologetic, and I think he blamed the booze, didn't he? He said that. And then he said that the suspension was disproportionate. And then he tried to argue that he hadn't damaged Parliament's reputation because the events happened at a private members' club. It was a very tenuous argument, I have to say. But the idea being that he wasn't really there in his capacity as chief whip or as an MP. He was just there at a private members' club. But anyway, the independent expert panel sort of stroked their chins, thought about this for a while and said, I'm not sure about that. We think that the appellant's arguments are misconceived or erroneous, and the sanction is far from being arbitrary or disproportionate. It is interesting, though, that Pincher has this place in history as being, as you say, the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, when we look back, I don't think we will think that was the thing that brought Boris Johnson down. I think that will be the thing that kind of kicked him out the door finally. And actually, Pincher has become, I think, slightly totemic in this as not exactly for his own actions, if this makes sense, but for what people knew about his behaviour but were not prepared to say. In other words, people turning a blind eye to the Pincher-like behaviour that was going on in Parliament that then became intolerable or impossible to stomach or impossible to
and Johnson lied about
look at as a leadership role. And I think that was why Pincher and Johnson's fortunes became so enmeshed. But I love the way you say we've got 2 by-elections, of course, because actually we've just had 3.
Yeah.
And at some point you've got to say, the trickle-down effect is not really what you want in your possibly or almost certainly final year of being Prime Minister before the election, because it is naturally very hard for the party of government, the party in power, to win by-elections. We know that. It is more unusual for them to sort of hold on to or to win seats when, if you like, the current or the tide is against you. And so to have this endless drip effect of people leaving, many of whom are leaving and writing terrible letters when they go, aka Nadine Dorries, makes it much harder for Rishi Sunak to turn around and say, don't worry, I've got a grip on all this. We've got plenty of others.
Well, and indeed, it's so much worse as well for Sunak to have them not just happen on the same day. I mean, in a way, Dorries has really wounded him for a final time in that. Had she gone when, say, Nigel Adams went Selby MP, you can contain the damage, you can put it all in one day.
You split the day in 3.
Yeah, exactly. By having a drip, so you've got October the 19th will be mid-beds. And then you'll have this, probably they'll move the writ, I would imagine sometime in November, early November, mid-November, that you'll have this by-election, so 3 weeks or 4 weeks maybe between them. That again, it allows the Labour Party to do is not only have 2 potentially exceptional news days, 2 terrible days for Sunak, where he's got to justify the fact that he's not turning it around, even in these really safe Conservative seats. I mean, in both cases, we're talking about majorities of nearly or well over 20,000.
Yeah.
These should be safe as houses seats. But also that the Labour Party is able to split its resources. It can focus on 1 seat entirely for that period and then put all on a bit of a roll, having had some momentum. Look, we did it in mid-beds. If we can do it in mid-beds with a 25,000 majority, which we've never held before, my word, of course we can do it in Tamworth. We had it in 2010, as recently as 2010. So it's really bad. Spare a thought as well for poor old Eddie Hughes, who is a government minister and currently a Walsall MP. Now, Hughes is doing what is called in politics the chicken run, which is that, I mean, in fairness to him, his Walsall seat is being abolished as part of the boundary changes, and he may well have lost it anyway. So he's decided he has actually been adopted as the parliamentary candidate for Tamworth for the next election. But unfortunately, he can't just do the chicken run now, because that would mean that you just trigger another by-election in Walsall. So he's having to hold on, as he's made clear on Facebook today. He's having to basically hold on, and the Conservatives are going to have to choose another candidate in Tamworth for this by-election. Of course, theoretically, if they were to win it, that means, well, he's going to have to find another seat or he'll be seatless. But, this is, I think we're at that point in the electoral cycle, we've talked about it before, I think we're at that point where probably, I'm not sure the government could win a by-election anywhere right now. I'm not sure it has, and you contrast that with what is Rutherglen, which is going to be a far more competitive battle between Labour and the SNP, which kind of shows you the 2 contrasting fortunes of the 2 governments at the moment. The SNP are down, but they're not out. They're still competitive. The Conservatives are down and they feel like they're completely out.
Which is why I think if you were Prime Minister, you would be so delighted and so in need of something that was, we can probably say, unblemished good news. And that is this rejoining that Britain will make of the European Union science programme. It's called Horizon. Brexit sort of stuffed our membership of so many EU projects and communities and sort of collaborations. And now after 2 years, we get to go back in, and it's being hailed as a boost for research and relations with Brussels, and essentially it gives you funding to help collaboration between countries. And if you want to collaborate successfully on science, then you really need to have the collaboration, you need to have the funding. The problem, I'm guessing, with this whole thing is that much as we love the fanfare and the salute and the isn't it great, we've all got this. And you look down the list and, Michelle Donlan, who's the Science and Technologies Secretary now, is going, it's great news, it's wonderful news.
We're
and
back
everyone's
in.
going, it's great news, it's wonderful news. What you have to therefore admit is that it was really bad news that we were forced to quit. And it was a really bad move that we had to leave what could only ever be seen as a helpful and collaborative programme that allowed science and British research to flourish. And so I guess the inexorable logic of this is that if this is a much better move, then why on earth did we put ourselves through such a cataclysmic shock that took so many of these collaborations away?
Yeah, and obviously in that time as well, UK scientists who, as you say, I mean, they're thrilled about this announcement. They've been pressuring the government on it month after month after month, basically since Brexit happened, because it is a huge scheme. It's the biggest collaborative scientific scheme in the world. It's nearly 100 billion euros. But of course, we've missed out on 3 years worth of grants. Scientists can apply for it today. But it's also, so there's a literal cost to it, it's also going to be more expensive for us than it would have been had we retained our membership in the first place. And I think that is why actually I think Horizon is a really good kind of parable, a microcosm for where UK-EU relations are going, which is that slowly but surely, especially under an incoming Labour government, which doesn't have any of the internal fractures and fissures about this, ideological fissures about it that the Conservatives do, we will slowly but surely re-engage and reapply to all sorts of different programmes, which are, in essence, always were advantageous for us to be a part of. But the difference is that we will be doing so not on our terms, not as being able to dictate the terms, or at least be a key part of negotiating the terms, but they will be in so many ways imposed upon us. On each and different occasion, we will find the terms are that little bit worse than had we stayed in the first place.
Well, I think
and
you'll
been able
hear
to negotiate as part of the Council of Ministers.
The word that you'll hear a lot is bespoke,
yeah,
which sounds like you've just had the finest tailor-made suit, fitted. But actually what it spells out is we'll pay a bit more, we'll still be excluded from certain areas like Euratom and Galileo, which is like the GPS for satellites. There will be things going on that we're still not part of, but we have to frame it as if we've chosen not to rejoin that stuff rather than, the doors have shut or the cost is prohibitive or whatever, because this is a new framework. And I suppose the last thing I'd say on this is that when you hear the rhetoric coming from Rishi Sunak, which is still about the sort of culture wars and having to appease the sort of hard right of his party, it is interesting that, yes, today he's gone off to India to sort of, woo Narendra Modi, and he's looking for trade deals there. Back at home, he's actually having to get on with the stuff that just starts to make people's lives easier.
Yeah, and Sunak, in fairness, the only reason this deal has got over the line is because of the Windsor Framework. So we wouldn't have been, the EU had made clear, and we should say, by the way, EU member states still have to approve our
re-engagement.
Still have to approve our reapplication, as it were. But there's no way this would have happened under a Johnson government, because Johnson wouldn't have signed the Windsor Framework, and they had made clear, the EU, that there was going to be no agreement on Horizon unless there was some sort of solution. I mean, it hasn't been a complete solution, but at least some sort of progress.
This is sort of patching up punctures, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Putting little sticky bits on the tyres inside your bike to just get the thing to turn again.
And that's the next 20 to 30 years.
Yeah. Before we go, we're going to take you to Mexico, which is pretty unusual. We don't cover a lot of South America, but something is happening there now, which lies in such a stark contrast to its neighbour across the border. We thought we should flag it up to you because Mexico has just decriminalised abortion in a landmark Supreme Court ruling. It's literally the mirror image of what happened in America under the overturning of Roe versus Wade a year ago.
Yeah, this decision comes 2 years, almost 2 years, after the court unanimously ruled that penalising an abortion is unconstitutional. That was obviously hailed as a watershed moment for Mexico, but not least when you consider just how Catholic and religious and Christian in so many ways Mexico still is. Nonetheless, it mirrors a wider move across Latin and South America to more liberal policies on all sorts of social issues, which, as Emily said, contrasts starkly with what has happened in the United States.
Now, to put this in sort of political context for you, Mexico's coming up to an election in which two leading candidates, the presidential candidates, are both female. So there are some who are questioning whether this is basically, a cynical way of attracting what you might call the woman's vote. But Mexico is a highly dangerous country. I mean, for many people, we know about how much of Mexico is enthralled to drugs cartels and all the rest of it. But it's a very dangerous country for women. And so this kind of move almost seems as if it might be reaching out to those who are saying we just need to take some control back of lives that seem kind of out of control. And at the moment, in 20 states, 11 of the country's states do permit abortion in sort of certain circumstances. 10 can still fight to say no on a sort of state-by-state basis. But they will now have to abide by the Supreme Court's decision, and campaigners say they will fight to get the law changed in every single state. Well, joining us now is Elena Rodriguez Falcon. She's an academic, she's a campaigner for women's rights, and she is in fact the winner of the Every Woman 2020 award, which has put women in technology at the forefront of her campaigning. And Elena, just tell us about this overnight decision. Did it come as a surprise to you and to the people of Mexico?
Well, Mexico has been working really hard to get gender parity and equality for many, many years. And recently, this current president has done quite a lot towards that. But just until yesterday, there were about 10 states in Mexico that had decriminalized abortion. So there are 20 odd more states that hadn't done that. So to me, it is a bit of a surprise, a welcome surprise, but a surprise nevertheless that it happened quite quickly. And I do wonder whether that coincides with the fact that the two candidates announced for the presidency next year are women, both of them. So it is a surprise to me, but welcome.
So just unpack that for us. You've got two presidential female candidates, but this was presumably done by an independent Supreme Court. I mean, do you think it was politics behind this decision? Yes.
Well, I'm speculating here, and I cannot speak on behalf of government in Mexico. It just seems like a coincidence to me. As I said, Mexico has been working towards gender equality for a long time, but it is not Barbie land. Let me make sure I am clear, because only 120 years ago, Mexican women didn't have a right to vote. And the UN has rated Mexico as one of the most violent countries for women in the world. So there is some contradiction. However, as a friend of mine said, the choice in when and whether to have a child is perhaps the greatest right a woman can have, and abortion is part of that. So I think this is a win towards achieving gender equality.
Elena, do you think that this is the end of the matter? I mean, obviously some people listening to this might be surprised, and to the extent that, Mexico remains a deeply Catholic country. President López Obrador has said that it should be respected, the Supreme Court decision. But do you think that more conservative forces within Mexico will let the matter rest here, or will there be an attempt at a backlash?
I think there will be a backlash. I don't have any doubts about that. Mexico is a deeply Christian country, mostly Catholic country, and I haven't spoken to my mom about it because this happened overnight. But I'm sure, and my mom is very liberal. I'm a gay woman, so she's very liberal, and yet the matter of abortion is something that troubles her, because it's been there as a taboo for many years. I think Catholic bodies and people against this decision will carry on trying to stop it from actually being implemented. I don't know whether it's going to happen in reality, but right now I know that criminalization has been paused, so health workers, women can have the right to have an abortion and to provide that service. But I think things will continue to unravel here.
Yeah, it's so important to mention that people who are working in the service of healthcare have to be able to go about their jobs without fear of prosecution, which is what we are now seeing, of course, across the US with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I mean, when you just look at not just Mexico, but your neighbours in Latin and South America, when you look at Colombia and Argentina and Uruguay and Guyana, who have all moved to either legalise or decriminalise abortion, they're going in one direction, perhaps you'd call it a progressive direction, and you look at what's happening across the border in the US, which is the complete unravelling of that movement. What do you think?
I think countries are evolving in different ways. Latin America has been behind women's rights for many years, and I think we are catching up. What's happening in the US, I can't speak for the US, but I do feel that religious bodies are gaining support, and therefore I think there is this movement backwards. Latin America, whilst Christian, I think is becoming more liberal. Yeah. And with so much violence towards women, I think there has to be some balance. And I don't know, and again, this is a speculation, but I see from afar, from the UK, great campaigns from women standing outside the government palace in Mexico City, thousands of women there fighting really very hard to get their voice heard, indigenous groups, etc. And something has to give. So I wonder whether this is, I'll give you something whilst everything else can be sorted. I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I suppose we may well end up in the absolutely extraordinary situation that I think, a few years ago, no one would have seen coming, of seeing American women from the southern United States in particular, where it is especially difficult to access an abortion post the overturning of Roe, travelling to Mexico to get their health services and to secure an abortion, which is legal.
I think that's completely possible. Things happen already in that vein. People travel to Mexico to get cheaper healthcare and surgeries, and particularly selective surgeries. I think that's quite dangerous. But if you're not in your country and you are not accessing health in your where people understand your health specifically, but I can see that happening myself as well.
Elena, thanks so much for joining us. Just great to have your thoughts on the newsagents today.
Thank you.
Elena Rodriguez Falcon. That's it from us.
Back tomorrow.
Yeah, unless we find the prisoner lurking in the newsagents HQ midst, in which case we will interrupt whatever we're doing.
John is away for the next 2 weeks. We've got
a spare seat.
We've got a spare seat. And he's obviously a very versatile kind of guy.
Very much so. And can lie low.
John could take him to Australia, I suppose. That's where we used to send them. They never got out then. Well, they did. They just started a whole country. Sorry, Australian listeners.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.